What would you call a father who locks his 6 months pregnant daughter outside in 39-degree rain while she bleeds on the front steps of his perfect house? The night it happened, the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was louder than the storm, louder than my pulse, louder than my baby's confused kicks under my ribs. One moment I was standing in his doorway, holding out a medical consent form with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and the next I was staring at my own reflection in the glass as my father turned away. Through the window I'd helped design, I watched my older brother Marcus raise his whiskey in a lazy toast, his mouth forming the same words they'd used on me my entire life. Dramatic, ungrateful, too sensitive. They didn't drag me outside or slam the door in my face. They simply closed it with the bored efficiency of men shutting out a draft instead of their only daughter in a medical crisis. Within minutes my wool coat was soaked, Pacific Northwest rain driving through the fabric until it clung to my spine and chilled every vertebra. At first I told myself the warmth sliding down my thighs was just more rain, that the stickiness at the backs of my knees was in my imagination, because naming it as blood meant admitting that my baby and I were running out of time. When I shifted my weight, a bolt of pain shot across my abdomen so sharp it stole my breath, and I felt the unmistakable slickness between my knees. The porch light carved a yellow cone across the stone, and there it was, a dark stain blooming beneath me, diluted by rain but still too thick, too red to be anything but what it was. My obstetrician's warning from 48 hours earlier replayed in my head. Preeclampsia, placental abruption, stroke risk, clinical words that now sounded like a list of ways my child could die before I ever got to hold them. Inside, the world looked impossibly warm. My father and brother moved around the mahogany table like actors on a stage I'd been written out of, wrapping themselves in light from the chandelier that used to reflect in my mother's hair. Marcus glanced up, saw me pounding on the glass, and for one disoriented second I thought he was finally calling 911, until I noticed the angle of his phone and the little smirk at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't calling for help, he was recording me, turning my terror into entertainment. My father leaned back in his leather chair, lips forming a comment that made Marcus double over laughing, and even without hearing it, I knew the cadence. The same rhythm he'd used to dismiss my grief when my husband was killed by a drunk driver. My designs when they won awards under my brother's name. My concerns when my blood pressure first spiked. Humiliation settled over me heavier than the wet fabric on my skin, because in that moment I finally believed what they had been telling me in 100 subtle ways for years, that to them I was not a daughter or a sister, or a mother-to-be. I was a problem to be managed. Another contraction rolled through my body, longer and meaner than the last, and I pressed my palms against my belly, whispering apologies to a baby who had never asked to be born into this family. My name is Lola Eulette, and what you're hearing is how 30 years of quiet abuse ended with a signature that cost my family everything they built on my back. If you've ever been the invisible one at your own table, stay. 3 weeks before my father left me bleeding on his porch, I was in his boardroom meeting the man whose signature would later destroy my family's empire in front of 200 witnesses. Every Wednesday at 3 p.m., I sat at a mahogany conference table inside a company built on my ideas, and somehow I was still treated like I didn't exist. 3 weeks before that night on the porch, before the blood on the stone and the storm that almost killed my baby, I was exactly where my father thought I belonged. In his boardroom, quiet, small, and strategically forgettable. The Hewlett Construction Headquarters looked like every glossy American success article you've ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling glass, views of the Seattle waterfront, art that cost more than most people's cars. But inside that conference room, the hierarchy was brutally simple. My father, Robert, sat at the head of the table with his perfect silver hair and his custom suit, the kind of man people called self-made, while ignoring the women he stepped on to climb. To his right, in the power seat, was my older brother Marcus, Rolex catching the light every time he gestured like he was directing a movie. My chair was closest to the door, not by accident, but because someone had decided long ago that I was the person most likely to be dismissed, sent out for coffee, or simply erased mid-meeting. I remember that Wednesday in November because my blazer barely buttoned, my 6-month pregnant belly pushing against the fabric, and because when I looked down, my hands were resting on a notebook filled with sketches that would never have my name on them. The air smelled like leather, printer toner, and the faint cologne Marcus liked to drown himself in before client meetings. My father tapped his Mont Blanc against a stack of papers until the room quieted, then spread a set of architectural plans like a magician revealing a trick. The waterfront tower project, he announced, savoring each word. $2 billion, the opportunity of the decade for whoever lands the subcontract. Around the table, department heads murmured in approval. Marcus leaned forward, grin sharp. We're perfectly positioned, Dad. Our connections, our track record, our reputation. Our reputation, my father cut in, is built on 3 generations of you let men who understood that construction is about strength, not sensitivity. His gaze slid directly over me as if I were part of the wallpaper, as if the only daughter of this legendary dynasty was an afterthought in her own family's story. I kept my eyes on my notebook, tracing the outline of a facade I'd been refining for weeks, tweaking the angles to maximize natural light and energy efficiency. My pen moved almost on its own, sketching an idea that would, ironically, end up defining Seattle's skyline under a different name. My fingers drifted down to my stomach, instinctively protective. The baby rolled, a small reminder that even after David's car was smashed by a drunk driver 2 months earlier, some part of him was still here with me. No one in that room had said his name since the funeral. "What are you doing, Lola?" Marcus's voice cut through my thoughts, louder than the hum of the HVAC. "Are you doodling again while we talk about real business?" Heads turned, some politely amused, others carefully blank. I closed the notebook like I'd been caught cheating on a test. "I'm listening," I said, keeping my voice even because any crack of emotion would be used as evidence that I was unstable. Too fragile, too much. Marcus smirked. "Good, because you need to understand how real deals are made. Not through your little drawings, but through relationships, through power. Things you'll never have because you're too weak to take them." My father nodded, completely unbothered by his son's cruelty. "Your brother's right. Just observe and learn, Lola. This is men's work." Grief burned the back of my throat so hard I had to look away from the glass wall, away from the reflection of a woman who appeared to have everything and actually had nothing that mattered. 2 months earlier, I'd watched surgeons scrub David's blood off their hands. Now I was expected to scrub his memory off my face and show up every day like I hadn't lost the only person who ever believed I was more than support staff. When my hand drifted back to my belly, the baby kicked, a tiny protest against the silence. My father saw the movement and exhaled like I'd inconvenienced him. Still playing the victim, I see. This is what happens when you marry beneath your station. To him, David's greatest crime was not dying. It was being born into a working-class family from Tacoma, a structural engineer without a trust fund or country club membership. If you'd married someone like Harrison's son, a real provider, you wouldn't be in this mess. Marcus added, eyes back on his phone, thumbs moving as he texted while my life fell apart. It wasn't the first time they'd rewritten my story to make themselves look bigger. 3 years earlier, I had stayed up for 6 straight months designing the Riverside complex, 40-plus stories of mixed-use perfection that would reshape Seattle's waterfront. I ran calculations until my vision blurred, integrated green spaces on every 3rd floor, and memorized every line of those blueprints like they were a language only I spoke. The nights before the presentation, Marcus had called. "Dad wants me to present little sister. Needs a strong voice in the room." I remember gripping the phone so hard my knuckles whitened as I said, "But I designed everything, the sustainable features, the community spaces," and hearing him laugh softly. "And you did great support work. Clients want to see leadership. Don't worry, your contribution won't go unnoticed." Months later, when Riverside won the AIA Northwest Award, Marcus stood under stage lights, accepting a crystal trophy for my work, while I sat in the back of the auditorium, 7 months pregnant, clapping for the man who had stolen my future and called it family unity. Earth to Lola. Back in the boardroom, Marcus snapped his fingers in front of my face. "Stop daydreaming about your dead husband and pay attention." The room went still for a second, my humiliation laid bare on the polished table between us. I swallowed down the fury, because in that moment I understood something they never would. The most dangerous person in a room is not the one shouting at the head of the table. It's the quiet one near the exit who is finally, silently done. What my father and brother didn't know was that while they toasted to you let men and mocked my little drawings, I'd already started building something in secret, an identity, a career, and a project they couldn't touch, even if their name was on the front door. I watched my brother accept an award for the building I had designed, while I stood in the back, 7 months pregnant, clapping for my own disappearance. When people see the Riverside complex now, they talk about the way the glass curves toward the water, how the community garden balconies look like a ribbon of green wrapped around the concrete. They use words like iconic and visionary, and they attach those words to my brother's name because that's what the Seattle Times told them to do. What they don't see is me, 3 years earlier, hunched over a drafting table at 2 in the morning, ankles swollen, eyes burning, tracing and retracing sightlines until natural light reached every corner of the affordable units. They don't see the 18-hour days I stacked on top of each other like bricks, or the way my lower back screamed when I bent over the printer for the 10th time in a night to recheck load calculations. I poured myself into that building, into the way air would move through the atrium, into the tiny benches tucked beside the elevators where exhausted nurses and retail workers could sit for 2 minutes and breathe. Marcus never even saw those benches on paper. He was too busy ordering bottle service for clients I would never meet. The contrast between our lives back then was almost comical. While I was in the office eating vending machine pretzels for dinner and redlining blueprints until my fingers cramped, Marcus was posting photos from rooftop bars, arm around some developer with a caption always some version of locking in the future of Seattle. He knew every sommelier in the city but couldn't read a structural section without my notes in the margins. Yet whenever a client complimented a design detail, my father would beam at him like he'd birthed a prodigy. "That's my son," he'd say, as if I were a junior intern instead of the person who had stayed late enough to watch janitors turn off the lights. The night before the Riverside presentation, I was in my tiny office, surrounded by foam models and coffee cups, practicing how I'd explain the sustainable systems in language that wouldn't bore a room full of executives. My phone lit up with Marcus's name. "Hey, little sister," he said, voice dripping with the kind of charm that always made receptionists forget to ask him to sign in. "Dad wants me to present tomorrow." For a second I thought he was joking. "Present what?" "I designed Riverside. I know every inch of that building." There was a pause, then a familiar sigh. "Exactly. You're too close to it. We need a strong voice, someone who can sell the vision. You're brilliant support, Lola, but you're not, front of room material." I remember gripping the edge of my desk so hard my knuckles went white. "My name will be on the slides at least?" I asked, hating the smallness in my own voice. "Of course," he said quickly, the way people talk when they're promising something they have no intention of delivering. "Don't be dramatic. We're a team." 8 months later, I stood in the back of a downtown auditorium in a black dress that barely zipped over my pregnant belly and listened to the MC call my brother the visionary behind the award-winning Riverside complex. The stage lights caught the crystal trophy in his hands, scattering little shards of light across the ceiling while my baby rolled restlessly under my ribs. David stood beside me, fingers intertwined with mine, whispering, "You should be up there." I smiled like a good Ulette, the way I had been trained. "Family stays united," I told him, repeating my father's favorite line. "His success is our success." The words tasted like metal in my mouth, like pennies and blood. When the Seattle Times ran the story the next morning, the photo was of Marcus shaking hands with a council member, headline calling him the future of Seattle design. I was in the background of one shot, blurred, half turned away, as if the camera itself understood my role in this family. Always almost visible, always almost recognized, never quite enough. Back in the present, sitting in that Wednesday boardroom 6 months pregnant with my second child and newly widowed, the Riverside memory sat in my chest like a stone. My husband was gone, killed in an instant by a drunk driver, and my father's only comment at the hospital had been, "At least he had life insurance, right?" Marcus hadn't bothered to show up to the funeral. He'd texted me a thumbs up emoji after closing a client dinner instead. Now, when my hand drifted to my belly, my father rolled his eyes and muttered about another mouth to feed on the family trust, as if my existence and my grief were both line items cutting into his profit margin. They called me a burden, a mistake, a cautionary tale about marrying for love instead of status, and some dark, quiet part of me finally believed them, not about my worth, but about who they were. Humiliation only stays soft for so long before it hardens into something else. Standing in that boardroom, listening to my father rave about the waterfront tower as the opportunity of the century for ULET construction, I realized I was done handing them the blueprints to my life and watching them sign their names at the bottom. The truth was, Riverside had been the last time I let them steal from me without a fight, because 3 years earlier, right after that award ceremony where my brother took a bow for my work, I'd quietly started constructing something far more dangerous than any high-rise, a second life with a different name, one they couldn't control, didn't profit from, and didn't even know existed. By day, I was the overlooked daughter shoved into a converted storage closet at my father's company. By night, I was the anonymous architect quietly reshaping Seattle's skyline under a name no one in my family recognized. If you had walked down the hallway on the 12th floor of ULET Construction and turned left at the copy room, you would have passed a door that didn't match the others. No frosted glass, no brass nameplate, just a laminated label that read, File Storage 12C. Inside, the room still smelled faintly of dust and cardboard, the ghosts of boxes that used to be stacked to the ceiling before my father decided it was generous to give me my own office. One wall was still lined with metal shelving because nobody bothered to remove it. The other was barely wide enough for a second-hand desk and a chair that wobbled whenever I leaned too far forward. The only window was a narrow slit of glass that looked out over a brick alley, a perfect view of the dumpsters where the building's trash went to be hauled away. I used to joke privately that it was fitting. This was where my father put the things he didn't know what to do with, whether they were outdated contracts or inconvenient daughters. But if you looked past the peeling paint and the humming fluorescent light, you would have seen something my father never truly saw, a computer screen glowing after midnight, filled with lines and curves and calculations that had nothing to do with the projects bearing his name. On nights when the rest of the office went dark, I would close the file for whatever support work Marcus had thrown at me and open another folder labeled simply Project Phoenix. The first time I typed that name, my hands shook. I chose it because I wanted to believe that something in me could still rise from the ashes of all the times I'd watched my work burn in someone else's spotlight. On that screen, the constraints of my family disappeared. There were no snide comments about sensitivity, no rewrites of history, no brother stepping between me and the client with a charming smile. There was just me, the city I loved, and the kind of building I would have designed if no one was watching. I knew that being careful wasn't optional. It was survival. So when I sent those designs out into the world, I did it under a name that belonged to me and yet didn't, L. Phoenix. No last name, no hint of ULET, just an initial and an idea. I set up a separate email account on a secure server, routed through a VPN David had once configured for his own freelance work, and I learned to treat every digital footprint like a potential crime scene. Files lived on an encrypted external drive I kept in my bag, not on the company network that Marcus and my father could access with a single call to IT. Every night before I left, I cleared my browser history, wiped temporary files, and made sure that if someone opened my computer, all they would see were spreadsheets and internal memos. It felt paranoid at first, but paranoia is just experience translated into strategy when you've lived your whole life with people who think your ideas are theirs by default. The first time a client wrote back to L. Phoenix, I reread the email 3 times, barely breathing. Your design solution for the south facade is genius, they wrote. We've never seen solar integration handled with this level of creativity and practicality. We want you on this. There was no condescension, no backhanded compliments about my eye while dismissing my math, no suggestion that maybe a male colleague should step in for the heavy lifting. Just respect, directed at a person they believe was powerful enough to stand on their own. More emails followed from people whose names mattered in the industry, directors, board members, city planners, asking for my input, thanking me for revisions, telling me my work had shifted how they thought about mixed income housing. They didn't know if I was young or old, married or single, pregnant or not. They just knew that when they sent a problem to L. Phoenix, it came back solved in a way that made them look smart for hiring me. What none of them realized, and what made the whole thing feel like a secret the size of a skyscraper, was that the flagship project I was designing as this anonymous architect was the very same waterfront tower my father was chasing like a prize he believed he deserved by birthright. While he bragged over Scotch about his inside track to the Sterling Development subcontract, he had no idea that Alexander Sterling and his board were already building their vision of the tower around a set of designs created in Saint-Jean, a converted storage room by the daughter he relegated to the chair nearest the door. For 2 years, every time my father mentioned the waterfront in a meeting, my heart would slam against my ribs because I knew I could end his sentence with the truth. The architect you're begging to impress is the woman you keep calling weak. On paper, in that secret inbox, I was finally becoming the version of myself I'd always known was possible. Respected, sought after, paid what my work was worth. But real life doesn't stop just because your portfolio looks impressive in a hidden folder. While my reputation as Elle Phoenix quietly grew, my actual bank account was gasping. David's life insurance was tied up in probate. My salary at Hewlett Construction was barely enough to cover rent, and my pregnancy had been officially labeled high risk with a stack of medical bills to prove it. The more my body swelled with a child who deserved safety, the more the numbers on those hospital statements climbed, until I realized that as powerful as my secret life was becoming, it couldn't buy me time in an emergency without one thing I did not have: my father's signature on a single devastatingly important line. $45,000 stood between my baby and the medical care we needed, and one man's signature could have erased that number in a second. The night those bills arrived, my kitchen table looked less like a place to eat and more like an evidence board in a crime show, covered in envelopes stamped with the blue logo of Swedish Medical Center. I slit the first one open with a butter knife, hands already unsteady, and watched the numbers climb with every line item: specialist consults, high-risk monitoring, additional labs, not covered by standard maternity package. By the time I reached the bottom of the estimate, the total blurred. I had to blink twice before the figure came back into focus. $45,000. That was the price tag on trying to keep my baby alive in a body that doctors warned was becoming a complicated case. It might as well have been $4 million, because the balance in my checking account was an insult in comparison. The second envelope wasn't any kinder. This one was from my insurance provider, the kind of corporate letter that pretends to be polite while gutting you in clean legal language. We regret to inform you that your request for expanded prenatal coverage has been denied due to a pre-existing condition. It read. The pre-existing condition they were referring to was pregnancy-related anxiety, documented after David's death, as if my grief over losing my husband at 28 disqualified me from deserving competent medical care while carrying his child. According to them, the panic attacks I'd had in the months after the crash were evidence that I was a bad bet, a woman whose emotions made her too expensive to keep alive. What made it worse was knowing that somewhere across town, in a trust account with my mother's name on it, sat $2 million that was supposed to be mine. When she died, she'd structured it specifically so I would have financial independence, a safety net she never had. But she had also named my father as trustee until my 30th birthday, trusting the man who charmed everyone in public and gutted his own family in private. Under state law, he could retain control longer if he convinced the judge I was financially irresponsible. And he had seized that language like a weapon the day I married David without a prenup. He told the court I was impulsive, too emotional with money, easily manipulated by men beneath our station. The judge had nodded sympathetically, never once asking why a grown woman with 2 degrees was still being paid an assistant's salary at a company where she designed award-winning buildings. That salary was part of the trap. On paper, I worked full-time for Hewlett Construction, but my paycheck looked more like a stipend for a college intern. It covered rent in a modest apartment and groceries if nothing unexpected happened, which meant nothing could go wrong, and everything did. David's life insurance was snarled in probate, frozen behind a wall of signatures and certified mail. My secret income as Elle Phoenix was growing, but those payments were tied to long project timelines. The big money wouldn't come until contracts finalized and milestones were hit. In the meantime, my prenatal vitamins, co-pays, and emergency ultrasounds were eating through my savings faster than I could replace them. Independence, the thing my mother wanted for me, had become a math problem I could no longer solve. My phone buzzed against the table, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail, but the caller ID read, Dr. Harrison. His voice, usually calm in that practiced OB way, carried an edge I hadn't heard before. He walked me through my latest lab results, blood pressure numbers that looked more like someone's bad cholesterol score, protein in my urine that had doubled in a week, the ominous phrase, preeclampsia indicators, repeated more than once. He talked about risks in careful, measured tones, placental abruption, seizures, early delivery, lining up worst-case scenarios like dominoes waiting for one more stressor to knock them all down. "We need to get you on a monitored care plan," he said. "Soon. This isn't something we can ignore." His final sentence landed like a verdict. "Do you have a financial guarantor who can sign off on an intensive treatment plan?" After we hung up, the apartment felt too quiet, the radiator ticking in the corner the only sound. I pulled the last envelope toward me, the one from the hospital's billing office, and unfolded the attached medical consent form. The language was straightforward. In order to approve a long-term monitoring plan and negotiate a payment arrangement, the guarantor needed to be listed and legally verified. In my case, that meant the trustee of my inherited funds. My father's name was already printed on the line, my mother's trust documents cited in the fine print. All that was missing was his signature and mine. One stroke of his pen, and the $2 million she left me could be used, in part, to keep her grandchild alive. One stroke of his pen, and the $45,000 wall between me and safety would crumble into paperwork dust. I stared at that blank signature line until my vision swam. Every cell in my body recoiled at the idea of kneeling in front of the man who had called my husband worthless and my grief inconvenient, of handing him yet another piece of my autonomy just to access what was already mine. The humiliation of needing him, of asking for help when he'd weaponized every vulnerability I'd ever shown, pressed on my chest harder than my baby's kicks. But when I laid both hands over my stomach, feeling the rhythmic thud of tiny feet against my palms, the decision stopped being about pride. It became about survival. I slid the form into a plastic folder, along with the estimates and lab reports, and tucked the whole packet into my purse like contraband. An hour later, my phone lit up again, this time with a group text from Marcus. "Family dinner at Dad's house tomorrow, 7 p.m. Don't be late and embarrass us." There was no apology, no mention of David, just a command disguised as an invitation. I stared at the message for a long time, hearing Dr. Harrison's voice, seeing the red numbers at the bottom of those bills, feeling my baby shift restlessly under my ribcage. Then I typed back one word, "Okay," and started planning what I would wear that wouldn't show how afraid I was, how hard it would be to walk up to that door and ask my father to save a life he'd never acted like he wanted. The next night, I carried that folder up his front steps, thinking I was going to ask for a signature. I had no idea I was really walking into the storm that would leave me bleeding on his porch while he watched from the other side of the glass. I went to my father's house for a signature. 30 minutes later, I was locked outside in a storm, bleeding on his porch while he finished his steak. The very next night, I slid the same plastic folder from my kitchen table, the $45,000 bill, the lab results, the consent form with his name already printed as guarantor, into my bag and told myself this wasn't about pride anymore. It was about keeping my baby alive. Outside, Seattle was in one of those sideways rain tempers, the kind where the wipers can't keep up and the car shudders every time the wind hits. The dashboard glowed 39 degrees while Dr. Harrison's warnings looped in my head. Preeclampsia, stroke risk, danger to the baby if I didn't get monitored care. I gripped the wheel until my knuckles went white and repeated the same line with every breath. Just get the signature. Don't argue. Don't defend yourself. Get in. Get his name on the line. Get out. My father's Bellevue estate rose out of the dark like a promise it never intended to keep. Every window lit, the landscaping lights turning wet stone into a magazine spread. As I pulled into the circular drive, I could see straight through the dining room glass. My father in a burgundy jacket, Marcus in a cashmere sweater, 2 plates, 2 glasses, the easy body language of men who believed the world existed to serve them. No empty place set for the widowed, 6 months pregnant daughter they'd summoned with a family dinner text. By the time I climbed the front steps, rain had soaked through my coat. The folder felt heavier with every heartbeat. I rang the bell and watched Marcus's outline move toward the door. When he opened it, the smell of whiskey hit first, then the look. Annoyance, not concern, like I was an interruption instead of blood. "What are you doing here, Lola?" he asked, leaning on the frame. "You texted me," I said. "Family dinner at 7. He snorted and glanced back towards the table. "That was a joke. You actually showed up?" My father stepped in behind him, eyes dropping to the puddle forming at my feet. "You're dripping on my rug," he said, like that was the real emergency. I swallowed everything in me that wanted to scream and pulled out the folder. "I need your signature," I said. "High-risk monitoring. My blood pressure is dangerous. The hospital needs the trust guarantor to approve the plan." He took the papers, skimmed the top line without really reading, and handed them back as if they were an unwanted flyer. "The trust is for responsible investments, not to subsidize your poor choices," he said. "You married beneath you. Actions have consequences." Marcus laughed softly. "Maybe if you hadn't married a construction worker, you wouldn't be on our doorstep begging." Another cramp ripped through my abdomen, sharp and deep enough to steal my breath. I grabbed the doorframe to stay upright. "Please," I said, feeling humiliation and fear tangle in my throat. "This isn't about me. The baby." My father's expression didn't move. "You chose this," he said. "Live with it." Marcus put a casual hand on my shoulder and gave a small shove, not enough to leave a bruise, just enough to push me back onto the covered porch. The door swung shut, and the deadbolt slid home with a soft final click that sounded louder than the storm. At first, I pretended the warmth running down my legs was just rain. Then the porch light caught it, turning the dark liquid on my dress and the spreading stain on the white stone steps into something I couldn't lie about anymore. Panic detonated in my chest. I pounded on the door with both fists, the folder exploding across the porch, papers plastering themselves to the wet stone. "Dad! Marcus! I'm bleeding!" I shouted. "Please." "Something's wrong with the baby." Inside, silhouettes moved. Marcus stepped back into view with his phone out, and for a split second I thought he was calling 911, until he turned the screen sideways and lifted it toward the glass. He was recording me. Time warped into something slow and cruel. I slid down the wall until I was half sitting, half sprawled, contractions tearing through me while cold seeped into my bones. Through the dining room window, I watched them return to their plates, lift their glasses, gesture toward me with theatrical eye rolls. At some point, the dining room went dark, the porch light flicked off, and I was alone with the sound of wind, my own ragged breathing, and the terrifying stillness of my belly. I pressed both hands to my stomach, begging for a kick, a flutter, anything. Nothing. The edges of my vision blurred, the stone under me tilting, and then, cutting through the storm, came the crunch of tires on wet gravel, a car door slamming, heavy footsteps sprinting up the path. "Jesus, Lola?" a man's voice shouted. "Lola, can you hear me?" Strong arms scooped me off the stone. A warm coat wrapped around my shoulders, and as my head fell against his chest, I forced my eyes open just long enough to recognize the face above me, the one man whose arrival on that porch would threaten my father more than my blood ever could. The man who carried me off my father's porch wasn't just any stranger. He was the one person my father couldn't afford to offend. At first, all I really registered was heat. After hours of cold stone biting into my hips and rain turning my fingers numb, the sudden shock of a warm chest against my cheek felt unreal, like some fever dream my brain had invented as a kindness before everything shut down. My vision was smeared with shadows and porch light, but as my rescuer shifted me higher in his arms, the scent of expensive cologne and leather cut through the metallic taste of blood in my mouth. I forced my eyes open and saw his profile. Strong jaw, dark hair damp from the storm, anger carved into every line of his face. It took my foggy brain a second to match the image to the one I'd seen in business articles and on the tiny screen during carefully controlled Zoom calls. Alexander Sterling, founder and CEO of Sterling Development, the man whose signature sat at the bottom of my contract as El Phoenix, was standing on my father's porch, holding me like I mattered. He turned toward the door I had been beating with my fist not long before and shouted, his voice cutting through the rain. "Robert," he barked, slamming his foot against the wood so hard the frame rattled. "Open this door." For a heartbeat nothing happened, and then the lock clicked, the door cracking open just enough for my father's face to appear, annoyed rather than alarmed. "What are you doing at my house?" he demanded, as if the real inconvenience was the billionaire on his step, not his bleeding. Daughter in the man's arms. Alexander stepped fully into the pool of light, turning so my father could see the blood soaked through my dress, the way my head lolled against his chest. The temperature in his voice dropped 20 degrees. What I'm doing, he said slowly, is saving your pregnant daughter from dying on your porch while you finish your dinner. For the first time that night, I saw something like fear flicker across my father's features, quickly covered with bluster. He opened the door wider, hands spread in a performance of concern. This is a misunderstanding, he began, but Alexander cut him off with a look so sharp it could have sliced glass. A misunderstanding? He repeated. She's hypothermic, hemorrhaging, and barely conscious. You left her out here in 39-degree rain. That's not a misunderstanding, Robert. That's attempted murder. The words hung between them, heavier than the storm. Marcus appeared over my father's shoulder, still clutching his whiskey glass, eyes wide as he processed who was standing in his foyer. Mr. Sterling, he stammered, You were just about to watch her die, Alexander snapped. Get out of my way. He didn't wait for permission. He turned, carrying me back down the steps toward a waiting Bentley at the base of the drive, barking orders to a driver I dimly recognized from earlier meetings. The leather seat under me was warm, the car already idling with the heat cranked high, and as Alexander slid in beside me, he was no longer the polished executive I'd seen in boardrooms. He was all command and urgency, pulling his phone from his pocket with one hand while keeping a grip on my fingers with the other, as if he knew I needed something to anchor me. Harrison, it's Sterling, he said the second the call connected. No greeting, no preamble. I've got a 6 months pregnant patient of yours. Severe bleeding, exposure, possible preeclampsia crisis. We're 3 minutes from Swedish, and she needs a team ready at the door. I heard muffled shock on the other end, then a flurry of clinical questions I was too far gone to answer. My world had narrowed to the rhythmic thump of the car over the wet road and the pressure of Alexander's thumb sweeping over my knuckles, back and forth, like he was trying to keep me tethered to consciousness. As a city light smeared past the windows, he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper meant only for me. Stay with me, Lola, he said. You hear me? Nobody hurts my lead architect. Nobody. The phrase lodged somewhere deep inside me, more shocking than the cold or the pain. Lead architect. He knew. Of course he knew. He was the one who had signed the contract with El Phoenix, who had argued with board members about my designs, who had staked a $2 billion project on the work I did in a converted storage closet. In my haze, I wanted to tell him that my father thought I was a burden, that my brother had filmed my suffering for fun, that the man currently holding my life in his hands had been listening to my ideas for 2 years without ever knowing the last name attached to them. I tried to speak, but the darkness that had been edging my vision finally surged forward and swallowed me whole. When I woke up, it was to the sound of pounding, but this time it was steady and reassuring instead of panicked. The quick, strong rhythm of a fetal heart monitor filling a quiet hospital room. For a split second I wondered if I was still hallucinating, but then a nurse's face leaned into view, and she smiled. That's your baby, she said. Heart rate looks good. Relief crashed through me so violently I started to cry, ugly, shaking sobs I couldn't control. Dr. Harrison appeared on my other side, dark circles under his eyes, his professional calm now threaded with anger. He explained how close it had been, blood pressure at stroke levels, placenta threatening to detach, body on the edge of shutting down. Another hour outside in that storm, and we might have lost both of you, he said quietly. Mr. Sterling got you here just in time. When he stepped back, another figure took his place in the chair at my bedside, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. Alexander looked like he'd gone a few rounds in the ring, blood on his cuffs, hair disheveled, jaw tight. For a moment he just studied me, as if cataloging every bruise, every IV line, every monitor connected to my body. Then he reached down, picked up a folder from his briefcase, and placed it gently on the bed. You scared the hell out of all of us, he said, and for the first time since I'd known him, there was something almost personal in his tone. I glanced at the folder and recognized my own work immediately, printed renderings of the waterfront tower, my sections, my elevations, my notes in the margins. On top of the drawings lay a contract I had only ever seen as a PDF, now printed and signed, the numbers as surreal in hard copy as they had been on screen. $8 million in architect fees, 2% equity in the project. My alias, L. Phoenix, typed neatly over the line for lead designer. You're probably wondering how I ended up on your father's doorstep, he said. I had a client dinner in Bellevue. On the drive back, I remembered you'd once mentioned your family lived nearby and thought I'd drop off the final contracts in person, so you wouldn't have to deal with them through email while you were grieving. He paused, eyes flicking to the bruise forming along my cheekbone. I didn't expect to find my lead architect collapsed outside in the freezing rain while her family watched from the living room. My throat tightened. You know I'm L. Phoenix, I managed. He nodded. I've known longer than you think. We had to verify your identity for compliance once you cross certain compensation thresholds. What I didn't know was that your last name was the same one on the proposals your father has been sending me for months, begging for the waterfront subcontract. He flipped open the folder, showing me a series of printed emails, all carefully dated and labeled. My submissions, his responses, board approvals, every digital handshake we'd made in the last 2 years. Each one was a brick in a wall of proof between me and the people who would love nothing more than to claim my work as theirs. These are all time-stamped, backed up and filed with our legal team, he said. Your intellectual property is protected 6 ways from Sunday. Your father and brother can't touch this, not without publicly exposing themselves as thieves. I traced one of the dates with my finger, remembering the night I had sent that version from my storage closet, heart pounding as I hit upload. Seeing it now, printed and anchored in reality, something inside me shifted. For the first time in my life, I was looking at my own power on paper, undeniable and documented, and it was not in my family's control. Alexander leaned back, studying me again, but this time the anger in his face had cooled into something more calculating. In 4 days, we're hosting the Waterfront Tower signing ceremony, he said. 200 guests, the mayor, the press, every major firm in the city. Your father and brother will be in the front row, fully expecting to walk out with a $150 million subcontract. He paused, letting that sink in, then gave me a look that told me he'd already made a decision. He was just waiting for me to catch up. What they don't know, he continued, is that the architect will be celebrating that night is you. So the question is, Lola, do you want to keep surviving them in the dark, or do you want to stand in the light and let the entire city watch what justice actually looks like? While my father told the city I was mentally unstable, we were quietly assembling the evidence that would end his career in a single evening. The first thing I remember from the VIP suite at Swedish wasn't the skyline view, or the fresh flowers someone had placed on the windowsill. It was the way my hand shook when I tried to pick up a glass of water, as if my body still hadn't figured out it was safe. My baby's heartbeat thrummed steadily through the monitor beside my bed, a metronome of survival. But my mind was still halfway back on the porch, hearing the soft click of the deadbolt and the laughter on the other side of the glass. I had been invisible to them while I bled, and that realization pressed down on my chest harder than any monitor strap. On the second day, Alexander came in without the usual entourage that followed him in boardrooms. No assistants, no lawyers, just a laptop under his arm and an exhaustion in his eyes that matched the weight in my bones. He set the computer on the rolling table, opened it, and paused. I had my head of security pull the footage from your father's exterior cameras. He said, You need to know what we're dealing with. For a moment I thought I could handle it, that seeing the truth would help me make sense of it. But as soon as the grainy video started, my own body stumbling into the frame, hands pressed to my stomach, blood blooming on the stone, I felt the room tilt. I turned my head away before the worst of it, swallowing back a wave of nausea. I can't watch them laugh, I whispered. Alexander closed the laptop immediately. You don't have to, he said. I've seen enough for both of us. What he told me next replaced the numbness with something sharper. While I lay in a hospital bed with IV lines in my arms, my father had been busy, but not with apologies or concern. He'd called Alexander's office and several mutual contacts, painting a careful picture of his troubled daughter, who was emotionally unstable after her husband's death and prone to exaggeration, a woman who might try to insert herself into the waterfront project despite not having the necessary experience. It was the same script he'd been using on me my whole life, just adapted for voicemail and corporate ears. Only this time, the man on the other end of the line already had a 2-year paper trail proving that the unstable daughter was the architect whose designs his entire company had been built around for the last 24 months. Alexander outlined the stakes of the coming week like an engineer walking me through a load-bearing calculation. In 4 days, the Four Seasons Ballroom would host 200 of the most powerful people in Seattle: the mayor, the architectural board, key investors, and executives from every major construction firm. The waterfront tower signing ceremony wasn't just about a building. It was about contracts, reputations, and a $150 million subcontract everyone in the room believed was going to ULET construction. Your father has front row seats, Alexander said. He's told half this city that he's Sterling's preferred partner, that waterfront is already his in everything but ink. He let that image hang there for a moment, my father, perfectly tailored, holding court under crystal chandeliers, before he added, he has no idea that the person we're actually celebrating that night is the woman he left on his doorstep. The plan, once he said it out loud, was brutally simple. I would attend the ceremony not as Robert Hewlett's tragic, difficult daughter, but as the person my colleagues all knew as Elphys Phoenix. I would walk into that ballroom as the lead architect whose work they had already honored with awards, whose designs had already reshaped their budgets and press releases, and then, in front of cameras and witnesses in the entire city, I would attach my real name to that identity. The contracts Alexander had shown me, the emails, the timestamps, the security footage, all of it would form a scaffolding of proof around me. There would be no way for my father to twist the narrative into one more story about his genius or my supposed instability. Agreeing to the plan was less about revenge and more about something colder, cleaner: refusal. Refusal to disappear again, to watch from the back of another room while my brother accepted another award. Refusal to let my daughter grow up believing that silence was the price of survival. In the quiet hours between nurse checks, I practiced what I would say, not in front of a mirror, but with one hand resting on my belly, grounding myself in the reality that this wasn't just about me anymore. Every time fear rose up, some old trained instinct whispering that it was safer to stay small, I pressed that hand a little firmer and reminded myself that my baby had already survived a storm that should have killed us both. The least I could do was survive a ballroom full of people. Alexander, for his part, never once spoke to me like I was lucky to be included in my own story. He brought mock-ups of the stage setup, seating charts, copies of the program where El Phoenix lead architect was listed as the centerpiece of the evening, and he asked my opinion on all of it. He listened when I suggested altering the order of presentations so the reveal would land harder. He took notes when I flagged which slides best illustrated that the Riverside Complex and the Waterfront Tower bore the same design fingerprints. When I faltered and admitted I was terrified, he didn't brush it off. He said, "Of course you are. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Lola. It's using the fear as fuel." On my last night in the hospital, he arrived with a garment bag instead of a laptop. Inside was a simple black dress, structured enough to look powerful, soft enough to accommodate the curve of my 6 months pregnant body. The kind of piece I'd admired in department stores and walked past because it felt like it belonged to another kind of woman. "Wear what makes you feel strongest," he said. "But if you don't have something you love, consider this an investment in the person you actually are." I ran my fingers over the fabric, imagining myself standing under the ballroom lights, not in the shadows behind a brother's shoulder, but at the podium, speaking my own name into the microphone. 4 days after almost dying on a porch my mother once planted hydrangeas beside, I stood in the wings of the Four Seasons Ballroom, that black dress skimming over my belly, a VIP badge with the name El Phoenix clipped to my lapel. Through the narrow crack of the door, I could see Table 2 perfectly. My father in navy Armani, Marcus in a perfectly cut suit, both of them laughing, shaking hands, soaking in the attention of a room that still thought they were the inevitable winners. They had no idea that just beyond their line of sight, the daughter they discarded was waiting for her cue, and that the empire they were bragging about was already starting to crumble beneath their feet. My father stood up to toast his legacy, and seconds later, 200 people found out the legacy he was bragging about was built on the daughter he'd erased. From the crack in the VIP room door, the Four Seasons ballroom looked like a movie set. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across white tablecloths, silverware glinted, and the air hummed with the low, confident buzz of Seattle's elite congratulating each other on being invited. At table 2, just where Alexander said they'd be, my father and Marcus held court. My father's navy Armani suit fit him like it had been sewn directly onto his ego. Marcus had chosen something trendier, his tie loosened just enough to look relaxed but successful. They shook hands, laughed too loudly, and kept gesturing toward the stage and the giant renderings of Waterfront Tower projected on the screens, as if they already owned the building. I watched my father lean toward a city council member, his voice carrying just enough for nearby tables to hear. 3 generations of Ulet men have built this city, he said, lifting his champagne flute. My grandfather laid the foundations of downtown, my father raised the skyline, and now my son and I carry that legacy forward. Marcus rose right on cue, adding, "We don't just build structures, we build family. Waterfront is the next chapter in that story. Hundreds of local jobs, all union, all rooted in Seattle families." I almost laughed at the word family, remembering the porch, the deadbolt, the way his thumb had pressed record instead of call. From where I stood, I could see the subtle nods, the impressed smiles. The room believed him because no one had ever given them a reason not to. Up front, Sarah Mitchell from the architectural board took the podium, tapping the microphone for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, if we could ask you to take your seats," she said. "Before we proceed with the formal signing of the Waterfront Tower agreements, Mr. Sterling has requested a few minutes to acknowledge someone very special to this project." My father settled back into his chair, that practiced smile spreading across his face, the one he used when he was about to receive something he already considered his. To him, this was a formality, a public coronation of the deal he'd been bragging about for months. Alexander walked onto the stage with the controlled ease of a man used to being the axis around which rooms turned. He thanked the sponsors, the city, the partners, all the usual language, and then his tone shifted almost imperceptibly. 2 years ago, he began, Sterling Development received a portfolio from an architect we'd never heard of. No firm attached, no long resume of past projects, just a pseudonym and a set of designs that stopped our entire board mid-sentence. The room quieted. On the screens, my concept sketches for Waterfront Tower appeared, sunlight streaming through multi-story atriums, rooftop gardens, integrated transit hubs. People turned in their seats to get a better look. The work was revolutionary, Alexander continued. 40% projected energy reduction compared to comparable towers, affordable housing units indistinguishable from the penthouses, community spaces that actually function as community spaces, not just marketing copy. I watched my father's expression shift from indulgent interest to faint confusion. He wasn't used to hearing the word revolutionary without his name attached. This architect insisted on anonymity, Alexander said. They signed every contract as L. Phoenix and refused in-person meetings because they believed their name would prejudice us against their work. A murmur rippled through the room. At table 2, Marcus leaned toward my father, clearly trying to place the name. My father frowned, jaw tightening. I stepped out of the VIP room then, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and started the slow walk toward the stage as Alexander spoke the words that would split my life into before and after. "Tonight, before we sign anything, you're going to meet the person whose vision made Waterfront Tower possible," he said. "The architect who designed every line of what you see on these screens. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my lead architect and the mind behind Waterfront Tower, L. Phoenix." Silence hit the room like a physical thing. My heels clicked against the polished floor as I walked between the round tables, the black dress skimming over my very obvious pregnant belly. I kept my gaze trained on the stage lights, but in my peripheral vision I saw heads whip around, napkins freeze halfway to mouths, phones come up, recording. At table 2, my father's champagne flute slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. Marcus actually said, out loud, "No, no, no," as if he could will me back into invisibility. I joined Alexander at the podium, felt his hand steady against the small of my back, and stepped up to the microphone. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady in a way I hadn't expected. "My name is Lola Ulette. Some of you know me as Elle Phoenix." A gasp swept the room. On the screens behind me, Alexander cued a new slide. My contract as lead architect, signed and dated, my digital signature visible next to his. Sarah Mitchell stood abruptly from her seat near the front. "You're Phoenix?" she said. "You're the one who just won the AIA National Innovation Award." She walked up with a crystal trophy in her hands, the one I hadn't been able to attend the ceremony to receive, and placed it in mine. "Congratulations," she said. "You are the youngest recipient in a país." The history of the award. The applause that followed wasn't polite, it was loud and sustained, the kind of sound you feel under your skin. I let it wash over me for a moment, then lifted my hand for quiet. 3 years ago, I said, I designed another building in this city, the Riverside Complex. On the screens, images of Riverside appeared. Some of you may remember seeing my brother Marcus accept an award for it. All eyes swung to table 2. Marcus's face blazed red, his mouth pressed into a thin line. "He gave a beautiful speech," I continued, "about vision and leadership, while I stood in the back of the room 7 months pregnant, watching my work credited to someone else. That wasn't the first time my contributions were erased inside my family, but it was the last time I agreed to it willingly." Alexander nodded to someone in the AV booth, and another video appeared, this one grainier, time-stamped, black and white. The footage from the porch, me on my knees, clutching my stomach, the spreading stain on my dress. Through the glass, my father and brother, clearly visible, lifting their glasses, turning away. The room went so quiet I could hear the hum of the projectors. 5 nights ago, Alexander said, his voice like ice, this woman, 6 months pregnant and in a documented medical crisis, came to her father's house with hospital forms asking for his signature as trustee of her own inheritance. He refused, locked her outside in 39-degree weather while she bled, and watched from the window. Dr. Harrison rose from his seat and identified himself, confirming the medical details, the life-threatening nature of what they'd done. By the time the video ended with Alexander carrying me to his car, the damage was done. My father opened his mouth, but whatever excuse he'd been forming died when reporters started typing furiously and investors pulled out their phones. Effective immediately, Alexander said, returning to the microphone, Sterling Development is blacklisting Ulette Construction from all current and future projects. Any firm that chooses to do business with them after tonight will not work with us. Chairs scraped as people shifted away from table 2. One by one, other executives stood to echo the sentiment. Contracts canceled, lines of credit reconsidered, partnerships terminated. As the empire my father had spent his life bragging about began to collapse in real time under the weight of the truth, a reporter in the front row turned her camera toward me. "Ms. Ulette," she called out over the noise, "you've just taken back your name, your work, and your story. Your father's company is imploding. How do you respond to their crisis?" Within 30 minutes, the men who spent my whole life calling me worthless lost most of their company, because for once, the truth finally had a microphone. The instant the porch footage froze on the screen, the ballroom stopped being a glossy celebration and turned into a feeding ground for the truth. Reporters shot to their feet, phones already recording. "Mr. Ulette, is that you laughing at your daughter while she's bleeding?" "Marcus, why were you filming instead of calling an ambulance?" My father tried to summon his boardroom charm, smoothing his tie, insisting, "This is being taken out of context." But the words fell flat under the weight of the timestamp in the corner of the video. Marcus snapped that I was dramatic, that people didn't know my history, as if there was any version of my history that made leaving your pregnant sister in a storm acceptable. Screens lit up all over the room as the clip hit social media. Someone near the back whispered, "It's already at 50,000 views." Like they couldn't quite believe how fast a lifetime of private abuse was becoming public record. A hashtag mushroomed in real time, Jagged Justice for Lola, followed by threads from women in architecture sharing their own stories of stolen credit and toxic family firms. At one table, a banker from Cascadia Trust took a call, and when he hung up, He didn't bother softening the blow. "Robert," he said, loud enough for 3 tables to hear, "our risk committee is freezing your credit lines pending review." A development partner stood to announce their immediate withdrawal from all joint projects with Ulet Construction. It was like watching dominoes fall, each one representing a relationship my father had claimed was unbreakable. Alexander stepped back to the microphone, not to twist the knife, but to draw a moral boundary. "This isn't about one bad night," he said. "This is what happens when a culture rewards theft and cruelty, then acts shocked when the bill comes due." He turned slightly toward me. "We can't undo what Lola endured, but we can make sure women like her aren't forced to choose between silence and survival." Then he announced the launch of the Phoenix Foundation, named after the identity I'd used to stay safe. The foundation would fund women in architecture facing discrimination and support pregnant designers and new mothers who were being pushed out of the field. For the first time, the name Phoenix wasn't just my alias, it was a signal fire. When the reporter asked how I responded to my family's sudden crisis, I could feel the room lean in, waiting for fury or gloating. Instead, what came out of my mouth surprised even me. "I don't have time to hate them," I said. "Anger already took enough from me. I have a baby to protect and a building to finish. What you're watching tonight isn't revenge, it's consequence. They made choices about my work, my safety, my life. This is what those choices cost." Saying it out loud felt like setting down a boulder I'd been carrying for years. I wasn't there to burn the house down. I was there to stop pretending it wasn't already on fire. After the signing, the ballroom fractured into smaller storms. Reporters lined up for quotes, investors and architects pressed cards into my hand, and my phone buzzed with emails from firms asking to meet with me, as soon as your schedule allows. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my father hovering at the edge of the crowd, stripped of his usual entourage. Eventually, he pushed his way to me, eyes bloodshot, voice rough. "Lola, you have to fix this," he said. "Tell them you misunderstood. Say you were emotional. You're destroying everything our family built." The word family made something inside me go very still. "You destroyed it," I answered quietly. "When you locked me outside, when you stole my work, when you taught Marcus that talent is something you take, not something you honor. I'm just refusing to lie for you anymore." Marcus rushed up, desperation replacing his usual arrogance. "We'll make you a partner, full credit, back pay, whatever you want. Just get up there and say we're united." I almost laughed. "I don't want to be a partner in a company that treats women as disposable PR crises," I said. "I'm starting my own firm, Phoenix Architecture Studios. We'll design the kinds of projects you brag about, but we'll do it with shared credit, real maternity policies, and zero tolerance for abuse." My father shook his head slowly, as if I were a stubborn child. "You can't build an empire on idealism," he said. I took a step back, putting physical and emotional distance between us. "I'm not trying to build an empire," I replied. "I'm trying to build a life I'm not ashamed to bring my daughter into." Security moved between us then, gently guiding guests toward the exits. I gathered my folder of contracts and the crystal awards Sarah had pressed into my hands, feeling the weight of both, proof of who I really was, finally visible to more than just me. As the ballroom emptied, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't social media or congratulations. It was Patricia, my lawyer, her name bright on the screen like a new chapter. I stepped into a quiet hallway to answer. "Lola?" she said, her voice threaded with a kind of satisfied disbelief. "The judge just signed 2 emergency orders, one about your mother's trust and one about your father's liability. You might want to sit down before I tell you what they mean for you and your baby." 2 days after standing in that ballroom watching my father's empire crack, I had $7 million in my own account, and a choice about what kind of legacy I was going to build from the rubble of his. Patricia's voice on the phone outside the ballroom sounded almost unreal. The judge had signed an emergency order stripping my father of control over my mother's trust, citing the porch footage and Dr. Harrison's testimony as clear evidence of endangerment and fiduciary abuse. The full $2 million transferred into an account with only my name on it, exactly as my mother had intended. On top of that, my father's lawyers, suddenly aware of how a criminal trial might play on the evening news, offered a civil settlement. $5 million in damages, full coverage of my medical expenses, and a restraining order keeping Robert and Marcus 500 feet away unless I chose otherwise. The money didn't erase the storm or the bruises or the memory of Coldstone under my knees, but it did something my father had worked very hard to prevent. It gave me choices. Instead of crawling back to you-let construction, I signed a lease on a loft in Pioneer Square with exposed brick, tall windows, and enough open floor space to scatter drafting tables like islands. A few weeks later, there was a new name on the frosted glass door: Phoenix Architecture Studios. My first hires were not the golden boys my father would have chosen, but the people firms like his routinely overlooked. A mid-career architect who'd been stuck in permit review for a decade, a brilliant designer dismissed as too intense, a young woman whose portfolio screamed talent, but whose resume kept mysteriously sinking to the bottom of shortlists. We set up a nursery in one corner, wrote flexible hours and profit sharing into our contracts, and hung a simple rule on the wall: nobody's name disappears from their own work. In February, in a different hospital room than the one where I'd almost died, my daughter arrived. Labor was long and frightening, but when they placed her on my chest, furious and squirming and very much alive, the months of fear snapped into something cleaner. I named her Hope Phoenix, not because I wanted to be poetic, but because she was living proof that something beautiful had survived a fire meant to destroy us. Holding her, I promised that she would never have to beg for basic safety from people who claimed to love her, and that her worth would never be measured in how much mistreatment she could quietly endure. While we were building something new in that loft, the world kept dismantling the old. Investigations into you-let construction uncovered years of credit theft and toxic management. Clients fled. The business council and elite clubs my father worshipped revoked his memberships. One headline described it simply: "Empire built on other people's backs finally collapses." Marcus's wife, Catherine, called to tell me she'd filed for divorce. "Our girls saw that video," she said. "I can't raise them with a man who thinks what he did to you is survivable." Then came the emails and letters, the late-night apologies typed in fits of regret. My father wrote about nightmares and shame. Marcus wrote about therapy and self-discovery. They both wanted access, to me, to updates on Hope, to some version of the family they'd shattered. This time, I didn't respond with instinctive forgiveness. I responded with terms. If they ever wanted the possibility of limited supervised contact, they would each complete intensive therapy with a specialist in family abuse, sign detailed acknowledgments of what they'd done, donate seven-figure sums to domestic violence shelters and scholarships for women in architecture, and formally recognize that I held sole custody of my daughter and legal control over my career. Surprisingly, they signed. A few weeks later, a full-page apology ran in the local paper. My name printed more times in one edition than in 30 years of company literature. Even then, I kept my distance. Forgiveness, if it ever came, would be on a timeline my nervous system, not their guilt, decided. Phoenix Studios grew one project at a time, our office walls filling with designs that carried the correct signatures. Hope learned to crawl between drafting tables, her baby laughter cutting through the hum of printers and quiet focus. And then, one August afternoon, Patricia forwarded a note. Both men had completed 6 months of therapy. A supervised coffee shop meeting was on the table. I watched my daughter stacking blocks on the studio rug, then finally typed back, "Set it up, 30 minutes, public place. They can meet her once, on my terms." Months later, I walked into that coffee shop with Hope on my hip and saw my father and brother already waiting, smaller and older than I remembered. I told myself I was only there so my daughter could see what we'd risen from. But what happened at that table changed the way I understood forgiveness, distance, and the kind of family I was willing to let back into our lives. The same city where I once stood invisible in the back of a room now drives across a bridge every night and sees my building define its skyline. The first time my father and brother saw Hope, it was across a sticky cafe table under bad pendant lighting, with my lawyer sitting between us like a human boundary line. I walked in with my daughter on my hip, her fist wrapped around my necklace, and watched both men stand up too fast, the way people do when they suddenly remember their manners. They looked smaller, like someone had let the air out of the versions of them I'd grown up with. No tailored suits, no boardroom echo, just two men in off-the-rack jackets clutching coffee cups they kept forgetting to drink. For 30 minutes, I let them talk to her in cautious, careful voices, answering her babble with tears in their eyes. But the rules held. They did not hold her. They did not take photos. They did not ask to make this right with one grand gesture. Instead, they asked about her sleep schedule, her favorite books, the way she wrinkled her nose when she laughed. When our time was up, I stood, shifted Hope to my other hip, and said, "We'll try this again in a few months if you keep doing the work." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a door cracked open, even if I still kept my foot braced on the other side. Time did what it always does when you finally stop living in constant crisis. It moved. Phoenix Architecture Studios grew from a handful of desks and a crib in the corner to a humming space filled with people who'd almost given up on this industry. A year after the signing ceremony, the Phoenix Foundation held its first gala in a repurposed warehouse draped with string lights and hope. Dozens of women showed up in borrowed dresses and secondhand heels, each one with a story of a father who told her architecture was men's work, or a boss who slapped his name on her drawings, or a company that pushed her out the second she started showing. We listened as one woman described leaving her family's firm after watching that porch video, another explaining how a Phoenix grant had paid for her to finish her license exams while she lived in a shelter. Looking around that room, I realized the fire that had nearly ended me had also lit a path for women I'd never meet in person. The ripple effect didn't stop there. Firms that had once laughed at the idea of blind credit systems quietly implemented them, sending drawings to review panels without names attached so talent could finally compete without being filtered through gender or last name. More women were promoted, not because boards suddenly grew a conscience, but because it became publicly embarrassing not to. Architectural schools invited me to speak, not as the cautionary tale they might have once cast me as, but as someone who had survived both a toxic family and a toxic work culture and still chosen to build. I talked about contracts, about documentation, about the boring but vital parts of protecting your own genius. And then I talked about boundaries, how the first one I ever set that truly stuck was the night I refused to call abuse family. When the waterfront tower finally opened, almost exactly a year after I lay on that porch, I stood on the viewing platform with a toddler strapped to my chest. Hope slapped her palms against the glass and squealed as the sun slid down behind the Olympic Mountains, the solar panels catching the light and throwing it back in fractured gold. People milled around us in cocktail attire, taking selfies with the building as a backdrop. On the far edge of the crowd, I saw my father and brother, not at the center for once, but off to the side as ordinary guests. They didn't approach. We'd agreed they wouldn't unless I initiated. At one point, my father caught my eye and lifted his glass in the smallest of nods. No expectation, no demand, just acknowledgement. It was the first time I'd seen him look at something I'd built and not try to stand in front of it. I've learned that rising from ashes doesn't mean the fire never happened, or that the people who struck the match suddenly become safe. It means you stop living in their smoke. My real family now is a mix of blood and choice. A daughter who will grow up knowing her mother walked away from people who refuse to love her well, colleagues who cheer when someone else's design wins the contract, friends who show up with soup and spreadsheets when life gets messy. I still get emails from women who watched that signing ceremony long after it happened, telling me they left a job, or confronted a parent, or simply started saving money in an account the abusers in their life couldn't touch. That, more than any skyline, feels like the legacy I care about. So if you've watched or listened this far, I want to ask you something, not as an architect, but as someone who almost died waiting for her family to open the door. If you were in my place, standing between the people who broke you and the child you're trying to protect, would you choose distance, conditional forgiveness, or a clean cut? And what would you tell someone else who is still standing out on that porch, wondering if they're allowed to walk away? If you were in my place, would you choose distance, conditional forgiveness, or a clean cut? Tell me in the comments, because your perspective might help someone who's still standing on that porch. If this story hit home for you, hit like so more people trapped in toxic family systems can find it. Subscribe to the channel if you want more real stories about boundaries, justice, and rebuilding your life on your own terms. And if you know even one person who needs a push to walk away from abuse, share this video with them today.